Hello and welcome to Perspectives. I'm Lian Peck. 2013, how does one even begin to sum it all up? With China declaring a no-fly zone over waters claimed by Japan, just how far is the US willing to go for its ally, Japan? Well, far enough it would seem, as a US naval near miss in the South China Sea is certainly adding to tensions. Now, on the economic front, Japan is wooing Myanmar with investments and aid. But is this linked to US efforts to contain China's influence in the region, which makes Myanmar the country to watch in 2014. Then there was a super typhoon called Haiyan that would forever be etched in our memories. While the international community responded in full force, it has raised many questions about the effectiveness of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations as ASEAN suffered its Katrina moment. And then we had the Bangkok street protests, people demanding change, which begs the question, is this unique to Thailand, or are there signs that the stuff of the Arab Spring could spread to our parts? How will governments address the niggling spectre of income inequality and the rising expectations of the poor and the middle class? Well, joining me on the panel to discuss the trends, issues and shifting power dynamics that are shaping the region, Dr. Michael Pulch, EU Ambassador to Singapore with more than 2 decades of experience in the Foreign Service. He's more than just a spokesperson for continental Europe. Professor Kanti Prasad Bajpai, Vice Dean at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, where he looks at international security, Indian foreign policy and national security. Piers Pottinger, co-founder of international communications consultancy Bell Pottinger, which works closely with governments and corporations on crucial election and other public affairs campaigns. Kavi Chongkitavorn, senior fellow at the Institute of Security and International Studies at Chulalongkorn University, a senior newspaper columnist. Kavi has also served at the ASEAN Secretariat. Now, let's start with China. It's been a year since Xi Jinping actually took power and headed the Communist Party in China. How do you think he's fared so far? Let's start with you, Michael.
Well, I think the limelight will be on China more than ever. We used to say this all the time when I was in Beijing, but I think for 2014 this is particularly true with the latest development on the air defense identification zone and the tension in the region. Now, when we look at the challenges for Xi Jinping this year, I think he has 3 challenges. First of all, he has to look at the economy. China's growth rates will sink, and he has to restructure the economy to increase domestic consumption, because the current Chinese model is unsustainable in the long run. So that will be key on his agenda. The second is, how do you manage your relationship in the region? You mentioned tensions over the ADIS with Japan, the relationship with the US, which is crucial. Mm-hmm. You have an unruly North Korea. There, I think his main task will be to reassure the world and this region that a China rise will continue to be peaceful. And the third challenge for him will be domestically with the party, to get unity with the party after the election internally and Bo Xilai's trials, yes. So to come back and have that unity.
Yeah, so do you think he's actually consolidated power given how he managed the Bo Xilai trial? And also from the get-go, you know, he declared this huge anti-corruption campaign and then sort of managed the Bo Xilai trial pretty well. So do you think he's managed to consolidate his position?
I think so. I mean, I think one of the other things to watch very closely is the pace of economic reforms. I mean, he set out a very ambitious agenda. And I think that'll be the test. If he can carry that through, I think it'll show that this transition now has really worked itself through, that he's in charge. The other point, I think, to be watched, and it surfaces partly with the ADIZ, is what's the role of the PLA and his hold on it? Does he have the support of the senior generals? Are they doing their own thing in part? I think that's to be watched as well. Mm-hmm. And let's not forget, about a year from now, a number of members of the Politburo will resign, and I think he will have to bring in another generation. So these are all signs of how strong he is in the saddle.
Yes. Now, this ADIZ, this no-fly zone, I mean, basically the U.S. responded pretty categorically, sending 2 B-52 bombers immediately over the zone to prove a point. Yeah. Why is China being this provocative, do you think, Kavi?
I think China, new leaders want to assert itself in this new strategic environment. And I think Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang has done well, and it will continue to do so. But in doing so, they also have to make sure that the region, particularly ASEAN, is also confident that they can work together, particularly toward the dispute, settlement of South China Sea. And ASEAN is very concerned that China will do the same over the South China Sea, all these ideas. That explains why ASEAN leaders reluctantly agree with Japanese leaders over the statement over the so-called freedom air flight.
This jostle for power between China and, of course, the U.S. and its ally, Japan, is played out very dramatically, of course, in Myanmar, you know, and there you've got China as the incumbents, you've got the U.S. as the new arrivals and newly engaging, and then you've got the Japanese, which are hugely invested. How do you think Myanmar is going to manage these relationships going forward?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult for them because, as you've identified very well, there are so many different aspects at play here. And China has already been very heavily involved, even through the sanctions. And let's forget the US still have a lot of sanctions in place in Myanmar. And one does wonder, given that the EU relaxed their sanctions earlier this year, what is the point of continuing these sanctions? Is it actually stifling the growth and the transition in Myanmar? I personally think it is. And I think, again, when it comes to China, apart from Japan, the China-US relations are quite complex. The US, as we've seen, has had a very rough ride over spying on most of the world, it would seem. Yes. And they, in turn, are very sensitive to Chinese companies' telecommunications businesses allegedly interfering and spying in America. And so the whole question of the US foreign policy in the region is very, very interesting. And so far, I don't think either Mr. Obama or Mr. Kerry have covered themselves in great glory.
Yeah, to your point of whether or not the U.S. is stifling growth in Myanmar because of the economic sanctions, you know, interestingly, of course, the Chinese feel that, you know, the U.S. is interfering and they're trying to contain Chinese economic influence. Really, there was a recent article in the Global Times, which is a Chinese government-run newspaper, saying that really the U.S. doesn't have the clout to bolster or revitalize the Burmese economy. So really what they're trying to do is just contain China. What do you make of all this? Why is China still so worried about this?
Well, I think, you know, the Chinese were in some degree in ascendance in Burma. And clearly over the dam issue, they've taken a bit of a hit. They're responding quite well. I mean, the Chinese embassy in Yangon now has a Facebook site, which is unprecedented for the Chinese. So they're trying to reach out to ordinary Burmese to make their case. I think just, you know, to come back to other players, perhaps, the Americans have certain limits. I think Europe's more active now. Certainly the British are as well. You know, India is beginning to step a little bit more forward in Burma. It's still elephantine India moves very slowly and ponderously, but I know I was there recently and a lot of Burmese said, when are you Indians coming? What are you up to? And I think let's not forget ASEAN. ASEAN is still a very important player in Burma. Yeah,
actually Europe has been making quite a few moves as well. I mean, so much has been made of the US pivot to Asia, but really it looks like the Europeans are also shifting their focus to Asia. Would you say, Michael?
Absolutely. We don't call it a pivot to Asia, but in reality it's happening. And I think if we look at the case of Myanmar, now, of course, China reacted to that because they were in a monopoly situation with all the sanctions of the big players around them. In my view, the success of the democratization process in Myanmar will depend on whether the government will be able to also show economic growth, a perspective to its people, because that will be, in fact, the test for the democratization process, and that's where other economic players do come in, including the European Union. We sent a delegation of 160 business leaders to Myanmar to see whether there are possibilities to increase trade and increase investment to give that perspective.
I agree with you. I think at the local level, Burmese want a better standards of living, and I think they have got that a little bit. I mean, high inflations and all that. And also, you have a regional level that Myanmar would like to integrate with ASEAN, having been chair this year, will completely become family of ASEAN. And then you have the global stage. And I think Myanmar will be very able to play all these major power. You mentioned China, you mentioned EU, you mentioned United States, you mentioned India. Myanmar has it all this experience. I think it will be a great fun to watch.
Not to forget Japan. Not to forget
Japan
the
as well,
Japanese have
yes.
come with
That's
bucket
correct,
loads
yeah.
of money
That's right.
to Myanmar.
Economic plans and all that, correct.
So
yes.
what is the next big test for Myanmar's commitment to reform? Would it be for the former military rulers to redraft the constitution so that Aung San Suu Kyi can stand for elections? I mean, that's the next acid test, would you say, Piers?
I think, yes. Unfortunately, I think Aung San Suu Kyi has not covered herself in glory recently with some of her international outbursts. And I think stating she's going to boycott elections, which she has recently, is a big mistake. I don't think that achieves anything. And I actually think there's quite a parallel here between South Africa, when the late, great Nelson Mandela was released. He worked very closely with F.W. de Klerk for their election campaign, and so that they avoided the retribution and the potential bloodshed that there might have been, and many people feared in South Africa. And I think both sides in Myanmar have got to see this, and I know they're talking to each other. Shui Man, the leader of the lower house, has been talking to Aung San Suu Kyi, but I think they both need the constitution to change. He needs proportional representation right the way through, so that he gets enough seats to maintain some sort of balance, so that there is some sort of opposition. And let's not forget that the lady, great, extraordinary person though she is, has never actually been in government, run a government, and so suddenly being given a country in such change to run, which is a big job in itself, just the sheer efficiency that's required.
Yes.
And I just do hope that, and I think the single most important thing is for both sides to talk to each other properly and announce that they're going to work together for the good of the direction.
All right, we need to take a break now. We're talking about the transition of power in Myanmar and drawing parallels between Myanmar and the South African reconciliation. Stay tuned here on Perspectives. Welcome back to Perspectives. Now, we were talking about Myanmar's reform record, and so far, really, even the regime's harshest critics, you know, have had nothing but good things to say about what's happened. The press has been freed up, you know, by-elections have been held pretty freely, and they've made a lot of good changes so far. But there are lots of challenges as well, right? You've got increasing tensions between the Muslims and the Buddhists.
Correct.
You've got an aggrieved Rohingya minority as well. I mean, whoever is going to come into power next will have to sort these things out, right, Kari?
Yes, this is the biggest challenge that Myanmar has to face, the internal stability and the future peace. And I think the Myanmar government now is hard at work to make sure that they can make deals with the minorities. And of course, the communal conflict is a big issue, and the government have to sit down and realize that it's the issue, some of the issue you need ASEAN assistance. This is something new, and I think Myanmar could be a game changer. It's open up to ASEAN because ASEAN has long experienced this. And another issue is that Myanmar has no experience in telling their story, you know, so this is why they free up the press. The press has helped them in the past 2 years in telling first thing, their own people of the situation inside the country, and then the outside world.
Yes.
That is why the press has played a very important role in Myanmar today.
The freeing up of the press has been pretty phenomenal, and in fact, you know, what's been discussed so far is the fact that those who oppose the so-called transition to democracy in Myanmar, you know, there's a real danger and there's a real fear that those who oppose it will try to use minorities amongst the ethnics to scupper this move towards democracy.
Well, as we discussed here, and Piers is quite right, to look at some of the big questions about the constitution and the ethnic minority issue has been always a key problem in Burma to get, in Myanmar to get this right. In my view, what we need to see is not only addressing the big topics, but also the step-by-step approach. Release the prisoners, continue with the democratization process and the free press, to take these little steps forward also on the economic front so that people see that there's a consistent, the right trajectory here that we want to see. And I think that's where we're...
Yeah, absolutely right. And of course, actually, when it comes to power, that's what Myanmar needs most, electrical power, because if anyone who's been in Myanmar will know how often the power cuts are. I mean, the country's rich in many resources, but it's still got a long way to go in terms of infrastructure. And as Stephen Lowe, one of the biggest businessmen there, said, if you've got it, we need it. And starting with power, that's going to fuel a lot of the transition.
Well, coming back to the ethnic minorities, you know, I mean, if there's any consolation, would you say that, you know, it's the fact that really they're not fighting for a separatist state. They just want more autonomy, for which they will sort of lay down arms for and stop agitating?
Yeah, I think this is true. Some, to be honest, do want something more than autonomy. So it's a mixed picture. I think some are fairly content somewhere in between, and some would like to exit. And there are external players that bear on that. Another point I want to come back to, though, I think, you know, one of the things that struck me in Yangon was this fear that the reforms and the changes have been top-down. And over the years, the bureaucracy has been emasculated. I mean, it's just been an implementer of directives from the top. And if you want public policy to be made in a rational, sensible way going forward, you need a bureaucracy that can offer a range of options, that articulates costs and benefits and so on. And that capacity simply isn't there in Burma.
And legal infrastructure is the other one. I mean, there isn't really a jurisdiction that is stable. And yet they're hoping to have a stock exchange in 2015, which personally I think is a very unrealistic goal.
Picking up on Pierre's point before we went to the commercial break, you know, you said that it wasn't very wise for the lady to say that she'd boycott elections. But really, don't you see that as her trying to press for, you know, the Constitution to be changed so that she can run? And, you know, if in the event that, you know, it is changed and she can run, I mean, are we in agreement that she will probably take power and lead?
I mean, personally, I think she will probably end up being president one way or another, with maybe Shui Man as prime minister. I think that would probably be the best solution, because I'm not sure that she's got a team around her that are strong enough to lead a government on their own. You know, the way she talked about boycotting the elections was very inflammatory. And I think the last thing the country needs now is people, you talked at the beginning of the programme about people rising up. We don't need that any more unsettling in what is a very difficult, and there are going to be hurdles all the way in transition, and we just don't need any more of them.
All right, let's move on, because 2014 is going to be a huge election year. We've got Thailand looking like it's going into election, Indonesia and India. Let's start with Kavi then, and the Thais, and obviously they're getting early elections, it seems, because they've been out on the streets protesting the Yingluck administration and looking for change. Is this election going to happen, and if it does, is it going to change anything in Thailand?
Well, as many things in Thailand, things keep changing. It's very fluid, and I don't think the scheduled election on the 2nd of February will be carried out, because there are a lot of factors going against it. And I think the boycott of Democrat Party, the main opposition party, is very imminent. So I don't think that will be carried out, because a lot of demonstrators and many other institutions want comprehensive reform, particularly on electoral process.
Right. So what does that mean? I mean, if they want constitutional reform and you say that the Democrat Party is going to boycott this, I mean, it's obvious they're making a huge play for power, but without having to go through the constitutional process.
Well, the government also was in trouble, because the governments act unconstitutionally many times. This is why now they decided to play out extra parliamentarians, you know. This is why you see people out on the street. But I think it will play itself out in Thai politics. I think all the stakeholders will now sit down from now on to work out how can they start comprehensive reform ahead of the election. I don't think election will go ahead anyway, because there's so many demands from everywhere. So they need, otherwise the same outcome, it's the same result and the same trouble. It's a vicious circle. And I think there's a big demand that we don't want this anymore. We want democracy, but not this kind of vote buying and the government that has no accountabilities. governance.
But the king's very influential in Thailand. And
It still is. It's
still
much
very
revered.
influential,
Yes,
isn't he?
yes.
Yeah.
And
But he hasn't said, and he hasn't really made a very strong position on this.
It's true. The army as well. And I think this is a good thing. So let citizenries and the stakeholder play themselves out. And it has been remarkable because it's very peaceful for 2 months.
I think the region needs a peaceful Thailand, stable Thailand as an anchor, not an unstable Thailand. And with all the countries around, Thailand has always tried to be sort of a course of stability, and I think that's what the region needs in the future as well.
Indeed. Let's move on to Indonesia. The world's third largest democracy goes to the polls after 10 years of SBY. What are you expecting to see there, Kanti?
Well, I mean, I think obviously a lot of expectations about the continuing growth rate in Indonesia and its democracy. And I suppose the future of this very popular, seemingly very popular, governor in Jakarta.
Yes.
What are his real capacities to govern such a wide, a big electorate, a huge country, and now quite a dynamic economy? He's untested in terms of the scale of what he will face. And I gather he's not all that well known in terms of, his real ability to govern.
That's right,
so,
that's right.
The growth story of Indonesia, it's slowed down slightly with the taper threatening. So I think there are all kinds of questions about Indonesia.
Yeah.
And, you talk about Thailand's importance to the stability of this region. Who could be more important than Indonesia?
True. I mean, the next election is going to be crucial, isn't it, Piers? I mean, as Kanti was saying, the economy has been doing phenomenally well until lately, for the last 10 years under SBY. And whoever is going to come into power needs to continue that.
Well, you said whoever. I think that's the key thing. We don't know who the candidates are yet. And really, there's going to be a very short time for people to make their minds up in Indonesia, but by the way the system works there. And for the candidate, the governor of Jakarta, who's clearly the number one in the polls, to sweep in, no one knows whether he's more than just a kind of mayor who can get the streets clean and the sewage fixed, or whether he is a man with vision and a statesman who can lead one of the world's biggest economies.
And meantime, the field of declared presidential candidates, Prabowo and Abi Rizal Bakri, I mean, they haven't quite inspired people as well. They're the same old names being banded around as well.
What is interesting for me is the democracy that is gradually consolidated inside Indonesia. Indonesia has very high expectations of their democracy. They are the world's third largest democratic country. That is the new label. They are very pleased with it. So this kind of new confidence in democratization will push Indonesia playing leading role within ASEAN and in the global stage in the future.
Yes, and this will be the first real regime change post the Suharto era.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. I think there's also another aspect to it. Indonesia, let's not forget, is the biggest Muslim country in the world. And we have a Muslim country that has a lively democracy. How can that be a benchmark for other Muslim countries? We looked at 2014, but there's an arc, a cluster of issues on Muslim countries from the Near to the Middle East that we have to deal with in 2014. There's Afghanistan post-2014. There's Iran, where we just had a breakthrough in the kind of way forward to find a solution to a nuclear question hanging over the whole region there. The Middle East peace process, which is crucial, and of course there's Syria and Egypt. So coming back to Indonesia, I think a country that is able to have a democracy, a viable democracy, and to be an Islamic country at the same time can be a bit of a benchmark.
We take another pause now. We're talking about the workings of democracy in Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Perspectives. Now let's turn to the proverbial mother of all elections, the greatest or biggest election that's going to happen in 2014. That is going to take place, obviously, in India, where we've got an electorate of 800 million people, and apparently of that 800, 150 million of them will be new voters. Kanti, this is going to be huge.
It's going to be huge, and there's a candidate on the horizon, Narendra Modi, from the far right, the Hindu right, and he's very popular. He's drawing huge crowds. He's an excellent speaker. He's charismatic. He comes from a state, the state of Gujarat, that's done very well economically. It's going to be very interesting. And he's almost certainly going to be Prime Minister. The only question is what kind of a coalition he can put together and what his margin of sort of dominance or superiority will be in Parliament.
Well, Sonia Gandhi believes otherwise, obviously. I mean, she's insistent that whatever happened at the assembly elections of late is not going to really get reflected at the national level, because at the state level, people opt for personalities at the state. And that, again, to Pierre's point earlier about whether, the mayor of a city can then step up and then lead the country and have what it takes to lead. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, he's at the apex of a party, and this party now rules in virtually all the states. The party's come together quite nicely behind him after some, factional fights. And he, an Indian state is not small. Gujarat would be about 60 million people. He's a man of some capacity. There are a lot of question marks exactly over the scale issue that you mentioned. So India is certainly not going to be out of the woods with this government when it comes in. But I think the country probably needed a change from 10 years of Congress rule. And they're going to get it. And
the Gandhi name, the magical Gandhi name, seems to have rather lost its aura.
And, with this new anti-corruption party, there's some fear or danger or promise, depending where you stand politically, that it may do very well in other states. It's come to power in Delhi, and it could become a kind of a viable opposition party to the BJP under Modi in many states.
A lot of people are predicting that the Congress party, this is the end of the Congress party and indeed of the Gandhi leadership.
But what that shake-up means for India, and I think that is the crucial question for the region, not only for India itself, but for the region, given the importance and the weight of that country. Does it mean that, for instance, India will open up its bureaucracy, will make it a free trade country, a country that is trying to drive forward economic reform? Where does it stand on foreign policy issues? We talked about the rise of China, but India is the other powerhouse waiting in the wings somehow. What is its position about what's
this party is much more pro-business. He's very much, sort of a culture to business and effective governance. And I think, there is a kind of optimism around his coming to power. The great difficulty is whether his right-wing politics will polarize India and threaten the minorities so much that it becomes ungovernable in the longer term.
Well, the thing is, the stock market has already gone up, and even Goldman Sachs has sort of re-rated its Indian equity stake, the recent report titled Modifying, their view on India, the fact that Modi optimism has really trumped the fiscal gap and all the other concerns that people have with India. And India seems to be on the up and up with Modi.
And that's good for ASEAN. I think ASEAN loves India that is pro-business, can move things quickly, because ASEAN has been looking for India more active, having celebrated 20 years of anniversary last year. Nothing really comes up. So I think Modi has already, created good optimism within ASEAN countries.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect a big change with him on foreign policy, frankly. There's a certain amount of bipartisanship on foreign policy. There's some sniping on the sides when you're out of power, but once you're in power, the reality is set in. I don't think there'll be a great change on Modi's part.
Let's pick up on ASEAN. As Kavi was mentioning, we had this natural disaster which took place in the Philippines, right? The Typhoon Haiyan, a very unfortunate disaster. But obviously that showed up also the weaknesses of ASEAN, the fact that, ASEAN didn't respond fast enough. The humanitarian response was lacking, the money was lacking, the funding, the political will was lacking. What does that say about ASEAN?
Well, say a lot about ASEAN weaknesses, but ASEAN weaknesses is also its strength. ASEAN has to do a lot more on humanitarians, because now this is a common feature. ASEAN is not ready to provide fundings because of the lack of money, but ASEAN can coordinate work among this experienced country, Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, get their act together. ASEAN Secretary General could not move because they have to wait for permission from ASEAN Foreign Minister. So he visited the site after 12 days, even though technical officer from AHA Center was there quickly. So ASEAN need to increase its capacity, particularly on this humanitarian assistance.
Do you buy that, the fact that ASEAN's weaknesses are its strengths? I mean, when the disaster happened, it was the usual powers, it's the US, Japan, which rallied to the support of the Filipinos.
Noticeably not China, who behaved atrociously, really, over that whole incident because of the bus incident in the Philippines. And certainly that was what the Hong Kong newspapers were saying. But I do actually feel that the ASEAN countries could have done much more with the Philippines. And actually, money is the thing. If you're actually involved in disaster management, money is vital because it gets people back into normal life.
Of course, the European Union was also there to help. But no, what we've seen in many of these incidents, and I was in China during the Sichuan earthquake, is that disaster management starts with preparation for a disaster. So my view is that on what happened in the Philippines will hopefully be a trigger for the region, a trigger to set up a better preparation system for ASEAN to react, but also more solidarity amongst ASEAN countries, because to a certain degree, of course, coming in quickly with aid will help, but also to show that there is an ASEAN solidarity, ASEAN community. We talk about the connectivity, ASEAN community. That's where the proof is.
I was just going to say that, you know, climate change is coming fast, and
Absolutely.
extreme weather events in Asia have been massive. So, you know, Hainan was just one more, although albeit a very serious one. There's going to be more and more of that. And your point about capacity building and anticipation is very, very important. I mean, we're worrying globally about climate change mitigation, that is reducing emissions. In fact, it may be already too late, in which case adaptation is the issue, which means preparing yourself for the consequences of climate change. Money is very important, but human systems, integrated human systems across countries and sectors that are ready to move when things happen. I mean, disasters are going to be the new normal, in effect, and you better be prepared.
Well, you know, when you talk about ASEAN solidarity, we've got Myanmar also, you know, just about to assume chairmanship of the bloc next year. I mean, it's all very iffy then, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, you have 10 countries with different ideology, political cultures, and with new members, ASEAN's culture also now is more multi-colors, so you cannot expect ASEAN to act the same. But on certain issues, ASEAN can act as one entity. For example, you said climate change, we should do that in the future. One of the biggest problems in ASEAN is that Secretary General does not have the mandate to move things without the permission. So you need to change that. In the case of a humanitarian crisis, SG must have the power to mobilize, fund everything. And I think ASEAN has learned from Haiyan that more power should be given to SecGen.
The whole issue of China and the way it has, you know, its territorial quarrels in the South China Sea. We saw in Cambodia for the first time that ASEAN was unable to deliver a consensus statement. That issue hasn't gone away, although the Chinese have stepped up the charm offensive and so on. I think that's another real challenge on a geopolitical, political, diplomatic level.
ASEAN moved very quickly to heal the relation between ASEAN and China. You have seen the role of Brunei, and I think that have done very well. ASEAN and China now agree to proceed to negotiate the so-called Code of Conduct on South China Sea. And I think Myanmar will follow Brunei's pattern, not try to upset, to make sure that the tension is being reduced. More consultation among members is extremely difficult because each ASEAN country now have developed rather distinctive relation. China is biggest market for all ASEAN countries, and Thailand now will have a very huge mega projects on high-speed train with China. Look at Cambodia, and at the same time you have other major power like Japan looking toward ASEAN after Vietnam and the Philippines.
All right, we need to take another breather. Has ASEAN learnt its lesson from Haiyan? Does ASEAN still have teeth? We'll talk more after the break. Welcome back. Now, ASEAN, we were talking about how it's going to try to cope with the rest of the world. How do you think it's going to balance its relationship with China versus the U.S.? I mean, that is a question which every single country in this region is trying to figure out, right?
Absolutely. Now, I think and I hope that China, to a certain degree, has learned the lesson from the air defense identification zone issue in the East China Sea when it comes to the South China Sea, because that is the tension in that region. And everyone expects that at a certain moment the Chinese make another move in that direction. I think the US has made it very clear, 2 points. One is every country has a right to have an air defense identification zone, and the European Union said the same. But secondly, we have to talk about the modus operandi and do this in a way that is transparent and does not create tensions in that region. And I think that will be crucial to give that balance right. And I think for ASEAN, it is important that all the key players remain committed to this region. I think there's a good chance that this will happen.
So do you think that the U.S. really needs to come up with a bolder solution to make power sharing in the region actually work? I mean, so much has been said about their pivot here, but really, you know, President Obama has cancelled so many trips to Asia that many feel that, you know, really Asia in the larger scheme of things still needs to take a number in the queue.
I think the United States has done enough already in the case of the Philippines and Vietnam. I was so surprised with the amount of money that John Kerry announced given to Vietnam and Philippines specifically to increase the capacity on the maritime security. And this will be the key issue for ASEAN to deal with both China and United States and Japan. Maritime security, how you're going to play this out. Faster boat, joint exercise, how you're going to deal with this is very important. And I think United States also has to make sure that the leaders come, consult with ASEAN, talk, and I'm sure that Obama will come to Myanmar this year.
I think that's the real point of the pivot or rebalancing or whatever.
Yes.
It's the diplomatic taking ASEAN and Southeast Asia seriously that I think is the most important part of what the U.S. is doing. But a couple of points, I think. One, it seems to me that ASEAN's ability to develop this code of conduct, I mean, there may be resources in the norms that it's proposing there for a resolution, also a stabilization between Japan and China, and of course Japan and South Korea, because there's a territorial problem there too. So I think ASEAN has a bit of a role there. I mean, it's looking principally at the South China Sea problem, but it may come up with ideas in that code of conduct that the Japanese and South Koreans and the Chinese can also take on board for their quarrels. And I think the other point that's quite important is, you know, can China and Japan really, that's the most serious quarrel today, can they find a way back to something like the status quo in terms of how they oriented themselves towards Senkaku Daewoo?
Well, I mean, it's more than a quarrel, isn't it? Because it's a deep-seated mistrust between two nations. And going back historically a very long time. And I don't think we've got time to go into all of that today, but it's more than just a quarrel. And I think that's why it's such a important thing for not just the US, but for the world to keep a very close grip on. I think it's more than maritime security.
Well, the thing is, how is Myanmar actually going to lead ASEAN if ASEAN needs to respond appropriately to all these challenges?
With difficulty.
Myanmar, yes, because I think Myanmar would have its own priority in terms of establishing its influence within the bloc.
Yes, Myanmar has a domestic priority. For example, Myanmar has said that it wants to improve the SME, small, medium-sized, and also to increase the investments to make sure that it can well integrated with AEC. It has done very well in certain areas, but you know they still need improvement. But being ASEAN chair, you can do a lot. You can set the agenda, make sure all the leaders come and attend your meeting and follow the ASEAN agendas. I think that's important. And I think Myanmar, being Myanmar this time, being the first time and all the world attention is focused on Naypyidaw, I think people will come and Myanmar should use the opportunity to manage this.
I mean, amongst the other challenges, of course, Myanmar, we haven't really got to it, but Myanmar, on behalf of ASEAN, has to begin to open up the economic issues. You know, there's the TTP now, there's the issue of the RCEP. How is ASEAN going to orient itself towards these? We've had the Bali meeting of the WTO.
Yes.
Our global economic arrangements, better or regional ones. I think Myanmar has to show some leadership there too.
Yeah, well, speaking of that WTO meeting in Bali, really, that came to an agreement literally by the skin of its teeth, you know, some sort of loose sort of agreement to facilitate trade going forward. But really, can we expect WTO to remain relevant to the region and the world for multilateralism to stick, given that, you know, countries are moving towards bilateral and regional relationships when it comes to business?
I think the Bali meeting has been the last chance for the WTO, in fact, to stay relevant. The outcome, as you say, was the usual last-minute compromise, but if properly implemented, it means cutting costs for trade for developed countries by 10%, for developing by 15%, and that's serious. We shouldn't forget that a lot of these bilateral and plurilateral free trade agreement negotiations are a reaction of the fact that the WTO could not deliver at a certain moment. And I think for this region, it is important that there isn't too much of a gap between the different types of regional arrangements that are being discussed. Because a country from Singapore is right in the middle of it.
Yes.
So it wants to ensure that there isn't, on one hand, a very ambitious one that others can't follow. Then there's ASEAN as a whole. And then there is a regional one with relatively low ambitions. And in between, there's the European Union, which is just finalizing a free trade agreement with Singapore and negotiating with a number of other ASEAN countries, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, to move forward for a bilateral agreement with ASEAN as a whole.
Would you agree that it's not a zero-sum game, you know, because a lot of people say essentially that the so-called agreement at the ministerial meeting in Bali was driven by fear that the big emerging economies, right, like India, Indonesia, Russia, I mean, they're going to be left out of trade pacts like the TPP, which are driven by the US and Japan. So it's that sort of fear which is driving, well, which is keeping the WTO alive.
If the magic word being growth, I think if we all want to see growth, and all businesses need to grow to develop the economy, and anything that the WTO could actually do to stimulate growth in many of the countries we've just been talking about is a very positive thing. And we have to hope it's going to encourage growth, because around the world, there aren't many areas where the great economists think there is going to be much growth next year and the next 2 or 3 years.
Right.
So I personally think that it was important that the WTO came to this agreement, and I think it may well stimulate some growth, which is great.
Quick last one. You know, as Michael was saying, there are already stronger sort of regional trading blocks. For instance, the ASEAN-China free trade area is one. And of course, you know, when 2015 comes, we're going to have the ASEAN Economic Community. That's going to be launched, which is going to see tighter relationships amongst that bloc. How is all this going to play out?
Well, I think ASEAN now focus on RCEP, Regional's Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and there's been negotiation for the past 3 rounds, and ASEAN is hoping it will be finished by 2015. I think ASEAN realized that if they not come out with a good framework, they're going to lose out to TPP, and the bigger economy will not pay attention to this. So I think a lot of pressure is on ASEAN to move very fast and consolidate.
Right, now I've got a feeling we can continue forever, but I'm afraid we've got to be wrapping up. What do you hope, you know, looking into 2014, what are your hopes for 2014?
No natural disasters. That's my hope. After the Philippines, which I think has been one of the most horrific things of 2013, let's hope there's nothing like that on that scale next year.
All right. Kanti?
Well, I think getting Japan back on track, I think, is vital. And I would say, you know, movement on environmental issues for the future. That's a very important thing.
Kavi?
Well, I have 2 ways. One is that ASEAN wants to see good relation between Japan and China. This is very, very important. Secondly, ASEAN must stay in charge when it deals with external relations. Make sure that all the countries at least on the same page on key issue. Just key issue, that's very important.
3 things. One is getting economic recovery around the world and getting the new structure that we get from the Federal Reserve steps right. I think that's vital. Second, get the tensions lowered across the globe and get some of the crucial political movements right, like post-2014, Afghanistan, Iran, nuclear, and lowering tensions here. And the third, have a European team in the World Cup final.
And on that note, I'd like to thank all my guests: Ambassador Michael Poch, EU Ambassador to Singapore; Professor Kanti Prasad Bajpai from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy; Piers Pottinger from Bell Pottinger; Kavi Chongkitavan from Chulalongkorn University. So if you think 2013 was a roller coaster ride, buckle down and hang on tight for 2014. Lots of changes in the works, new governments in many countries possibly, and more demands for better lives the world over. As the internal optimist myself, here's hoping things will only get better. That's it for Perspectives. As always, drop us an email or tweet us to let us know what you want to talk about in the new year. From me and the rest of the team, have a great 2014.